The taller woman's eyes opened. The first thing he noticed was not their hard color but the control, how she measured him in a breath and decided not to lunge. She spoke in English deep as a drum. "Sister, help, pal. Sister." The word found everything in him still tender. The grave he dug 3 winters past, when fever took Elizabeth, the empty room he had never opened again. He looked at his wind-sawn land, fences leaning like tired men, a barn with more light than boards, and then at the women. Helping Apache was the sort of choice a man made once. He lowered his rifle. "Inside," he said, and the taller woman, despite blood and dizziness, stooped and lifted her sister under the armpits, as if hefting a cap. Ezekiel took the legs. They had to angle the doorframe for the breadth of her shoulders. It felt like smuggling thunder through a keyhole. He boiled water, cut strips from a sheet he had promised himself not to ruin, and set the kettle back when his hands shook. The taller woman watched without flinching while he cleaned the head wound. When the other tensed at the touch around her ribs, the tall one pressed her palm over Ezekiel's hand, steadying him and the world both. "I am Ayana," she said at last, the name shaped with the kind of gravity that made him aware of his posture. "She is Eitel." He nodded. "Ezekiel Marsh." Ayana nodded once, accepting. "We did not come to make war with your house." "You chose the right porch," he said, surprising himself with the softness in it. "But the wrong county." Eitel sucked a breath between her teeth when he bound her, the kind a wounded mare gives right before she decides she can stand. "It will do," she said in careful English, and sat with her back against the coolest log in the room. Sweat ran down along the dust on her neck like a river finding a new course. Ayana looked through the chink without fear. "Not for you," she said. "For us. You know them? They know me." She touched the beadwork at her throat, then looked past the riders, beyond the ridge. "There will be more." He swallowed. The right thing always arrived with witnesses. "If I hand you over, maybe they leave me be." Ayana turned her head. "If you do that, you will leave yourself." They waited for the knock that came like a law. A voice called in Apache, then in English. "House. Come now." Ezekiel counted ammunition, not enough, and counted the breaths between the words. Ayana lifted her sister to her feet and nodded toward the door. "We walk," she said. "Standing makes truth taller." They stood in the sun, and the riders studied the 3 of them, the way men study a ledge before trusting it. The oldest of the 5 spoke. "You, white man, say your name." "Ezekiel Marsh." "You saved girl in spring water 3 moons past." He blinked. The creak and the fevered child came back to him, the shivering, the delirious Apache words he had not understood, but had answered anyway, with broth and patience, the way he had guided her toward the cottonwoods, and then left without wanting thanks. He nodded. "I pulled a girl out. Left food. Told nobody." The man's mouth twitched with something like respect. "She is daughter of Nalish. Chief says a debt was born. Some here say white debts are wind." His eyes slid to Ayana and Eitel. "Sisters of Nalish refused marriage to a coward with friends. They are hunted by tongues." Ayana's chin lifted. "We chose our own path." The rider's gaze returned to Ezekiel. "We wait at sunfall for Nalish. He decides if your mercy pays for theirs." He gestured, and the 5 drew off to the shade of the hill like wolves taking positions. They could watch forever. Evening turned the yard into brass. Ezekiel worked in the dark house with his hands and tried not to think with his fear. He changed Idol's wrapping and felt her temperature holding steady under his palm. Ayana drank water without wasting a swallow. Her head wound had crusted. He saw the strength in her shoulders not as threat, but as discipline, like the long straight furrows a man cuts when he means a field to feed him. When the light died, he heard the dry clink of bridles again. More riders approached from the west with the clatter of arrogance. Not Apache. Not neighbors either. Something between. He stepped to the threshold, closing the door behind him with his body, and met the badge before he saw the face. Deputy Marshal William Kane smiled like a man who enjoyed practicing a speech. "Evening, Marsh. We heard you were generous today." He tilted his head toward the dark. "Any hostiles inside?" "Only flies in my heart," Ezekiel said. Kane laughed for his men. "We'll have a look." "You got paper?" Ezekiel asked, and added a softness he didn't feel. "Or is that more a city habit?" Kane pushed him aside with 2 fingers and the weight of office. The men fanned, boots whispering across dry boards. Because he could not stop them without killing them, Ezekiel did something else. He spoke. "Remember the creak, Kane? When flood took your cousin 2 summers back, who dragged him out of the cottonwoods before he drowned?" Kane paused. He had the dignity to hate that memory. "You, Marsh." "And I didn't ask for a posse to watch me do it," Ezekiel said. "Sometimes a man pulls another out because it's right." Kane squinted like the sun got brighter. "Sometimes a man hides Apache women who put settlers in the ground." He nodded to a deputy near the bedroom. Boots stopped. "Bring him out." Ayana filled the doorway with stillness first, then motion. She came out with her hands open and her head high. Idol followed, slow, a hand at her bandage. Even the deputies, who had never thought fear, had to think about it now. Ayana spoke in the level way of a woman who had repeated words until they were steel. "I am Ayana, daughter of Nalish. My sister is Idol. This man gave water and shelter. Your law has no quarrel with mercy." Kane aimed his voice at the deputies, because a man looks at the place he wants his courage to sit. "Your father can write his customs in smoke. I read federal law. You'll ride with me to town." "Tomorrow," Ayana said. "When Nalish speaks." "That name keeps a lot of men alive," Kane said. "We'll see if it keeps you." They waited the night, out in a triangle of watchfulness. Apache on the ridge, marshals in the yard, Ezekiel's house at the center like a stubborn fact. Coyotes went about their business, without respecting badge or bead. Near dawn, a curl of dust appeared north like a new river. In front rode a man whose posture made the landscape look temporary. Chief Nalish had the kind of quiet that trained people watched. He dismounted, accepted the morning, and looked at Ezekiel as if measuring a beam. "You saved a girl in spring water," he said, without asking. "You saved 2 more in a White House." His English was polished by purpose. "My people do not forget." He turned one palm toward Kane, who tried to make his badge louder than his throat. "Federal law steps here," Kane said. "I have warrants for questioning." Nalish's mouth did not move, but the corners of his eyes acknowledged the performance. "Question in my language too," he said. "We signed a winter paper that says so." He looked back to Ezekiel. "There is an old way to think about mercy. If a man pays blood forward, someone must pay it back. Not with scalp. With duty." 2 elders stepped forward with a cord of plaited rawhide, threaded with bits of bone and silver. the kind of thing that meant blood had been made into law. Nalish lifted it, and the whole yard felt the weight. Ezekiel Marsh, by pulling my child from water, you stepped into our fire. I can adopt you where law sees you as kin. But kin is not a roof if heart is rain. He glanced, almost smiling at Ayana. Kin closes some doors that other doors might open. Ayana's head tipped, then straightened. A muscle moved in her jaw and stopped. Cain barked laughter he didn't feel. You can't just claim this ranch by saying a word in beads. Nalish let the man's noise pass like wind. I can protect this house until I decide where it belongs in the story. He fixed Ezekiel with a look that felt like a question placed on a table. Do you accept a name with mine on it? Ezekiel saw the path that came with the cord, safety from Cain, protection for Ayana and Itel, a translation of one life into a larger one. He also saw the bars, brother where a man might dream of husband. The moral sum was not neat. Mercy turned to obligation fast, as milk turns in heat. He breathed the only true answer he had. I accept responsibility. Nalish stepped close and laid the cord around Ezekiel's neck. It had a weight like a tool and like a promise. Ayana looked at him with a pride that hurt. Idel's smile was quick, made of relief and irony both. Cain swore under his breath, fought the treaty inside his head, and lost. He settled for spitting in the dust to mark the defeat as choice. We ain't done, he said. I'll have paper that outranks your paper. The chief's eyes warmed a fraction. You will have breakfast first, he said, and for the first time the men around them were required to laugh like ordinary people. Nalish did not turn the joke into a weapon. Power is easy. Mercy is purchased every time you choose it. The sun climbed, and the day began making decisions for men. Apache elders conferred in low voice. Federal men conferred loudly, because noise can feel like authority. Nalish finally lifted his hand. My daughters will not be given as horses, he said, polite and implacable. The one who calls himself a suitor beats his wives. My people say water remembers stones thrown into it. His house is full of stones. He turned to Ezekiel. You gave shelter. You will keep it. My daughters will remain here until I say otherwise. If they step outside this yard, they do so as free women, not as property. He looked at Cain. Federal law will not drag them like elk. Cain weighed the number of rifles around him and nodded like a man kept civil by arithmetic. I'll be back, he said, which was a vow and a threat and a habit. Ezekiel kept his house correctly small. He slept light with a rope around his heart. Adoption made people call him brother in 2 languages. It also made Ayana greet him with a hand on his forearm instead of something that would break men. He learned the curve of her quiet the way a man learns land, by walking it before dawn. He spoke with Itel about weather and cutting posts, and the string of colts coming along. He spoke with Ayana about nothing and about everything. Learning the right nothings took longer. When Cain returned, he did it with paper yellow enough to look official in its own right. He read it in a voice full of words, and emptier than thirst. By order of territorial authority, he said, all persons connected to violence at the Morrison homestead will submit to custody. He lifted his eyes to make sure the iron in them showed. That includes you, Marsh. Nalish was not on the ridge that day. That was part of why Cain had chosen it. But Ayana and Itel were there, and men who had seen them work did not see them as rumor now. Ezekiel stepped forward. If there is a true court, bring it here, he said. We'll answer with truth. Truth comes wearing a judge's coat, Cain said. And his desk is not on your porch. The deputies moved wrong, not careful, not respectful, and the yard felt it. Ayana said nothing. She simply stepped between the deputies and Ezekiel. It was like a canyon moving between men and their intentions. "You will not place hands on him," she said. "If there is law, we will walk to it, not be dragged." Cain reached for the only lever he thought he owned: fear. "You want to watch him hang for the way you bled on his floor?" "It was my blood," Ayana said. "Not yours to count." That was the moment when choice put on weight for everyone. Mercy had opened a door. Justice wanted payment. Ezekiel could feel two futures breathing down his neck. One where he surrendered to iron and trusted its sense of balance, and one where he chose the older balance of people looking each other in the face. He remembered the creak and what had guided his hands then. He chose the same thing now. "I'll ride," he said, "but not in irons. And not while your paper ignores the winter treaty." Cain saw the compromise and hated its flavor like medicine that worked. He nodded short. "Saddle then," he said, "both of you." He pointed at Ayana. "You'll testify to your innocence, or you'll hang beside him." They rode under a sky without opinion. In town, the judge had a round mouth used to say no. The prosecutor spoke the Morrison name as if silver rattled in it. They brought the suitor who had called himself wronged, son of a small chief with a large sense of entitlement, and he wore his grievance like a hat. He lied cleanly enough to hold men who wanted to believe him, and poorly enough to irritate those who did not. Witnesses lead too. The world often cooperates with itself at first. Then Itel asked to speak. She stood, winced once at the pull along her ribs, and explained in precise English what men had done to women under that suitor's roof. She named the wives who had lost babies there. She named the aunt who had tried to leave and had been brought back by men who called it order. She did not sweeten a thing. She was taller than everyone in the room and did not use it. The room used itself on her. When she finished, the judge did not cough. Cain looked at his boots so he could feel like the kind of man who looks at his boots when he needs to be a different kind of man next time. Ayana spoke last. "I trained to fight," she said, "but I trained longer to stand and not strike. I stood when my sister bled in a White House. I stand here while hard words are thrown. I will stand in whatever place your law points me, if truth points there too. But if law points one way and truth another, I will follow the one my father taught." She did not look to Ezekiel when she said father. She did not need to. The judge did what men sometimes do when the world drops a burden at their feet. They stall. He called a recess. He sent everyone to the street to drink. The street talked as if it had been there to see everything and then some. By dusk the judge reappeared with a decision that wore compromise like a coat. No hangings, no jail, for now. A hearing under treaty provisions would convene in a month at the reservation's edge. Until then, no arrests, no raids, no night rides with masks. If a woman or man violated that, the judge would personally sign orders that made Cain riot against his friends. Cain's jaw worked. Ezekiel let out what felt like a month-long breath. Idle's shoulders eased an inch. Ayana did not move at all. Her stillness, he understood, was not emptiness, it was containment. Mercy stored for later. They rode back to the ranch in that dusk, and found it mostly as they had left it, except for the way a place holds your absence, like a handprint. They worked, because work empties the parts of a day that trouble fills. They ate because hunger does not consult legal timetables. They slept because bodies demand what minds avoid. Days stacked into a precarious peace. It held until a night when the moon broke on clouds and brought wolves close to the herd. Ezekiel woke to the bawl of a steer and the far-off sound of men who had decided they were done waiting on the judge. They came with faces darkened and bottles of courage on their breath. The front of the house took 2 rounds quick for punctuation. Ezekiel rolled off his bunk and reached the door, as a man would reach a burning pan, on instinct. Ayana was already there, hair braided tight, eyes bright the way iron glows before it cools. Eitel moved with less speed, but the steadiness of a woman who has had enough of bleeding. "Back door," Ezekiel said. "Front," Ayana answered. "They expect us to flee." Then a lantern smashed against the porch post, and fire leaped like an eager dog. Ezekiel saw in a stuttering heartbeat the whole place going up. The quilts, the sheet he had cut for bandages, the ledger that kept order between Apache beans and settler flour, the beam where Ayana had bumped her head and laughed, the low table where Eitel had taught him to braid rawhide without blistering his hands. Mercy could build, but fire didn't care. He grabbed the pump handle and threw water, while Ayana and Eitel fought like weather. A man lunged for Ayana's back, and Ezekiel put him down with the butt of his rifle, then dragged him clear before the burning eaves could fall. He did not think about why he saved the man who had tried to kill them. He only knew the taste of ash and decision. When the last of the raiders broke and ran, the porch was blackened, the yard littered with weapons men had meant to keep, and Ayana stood breathing hard with soot along her cheekbone like war paint she had not chosen. Eitel sat down very suddenly and let her head rest in her hands. It was the first time Ezekiel had seen her reduced by anything other than injury. He felt something open in him that had been clenched for a year. Not gratitude, not yet. A kind of understanding. Mercy asks a price when you give it, and another when you accept it. He looked at Ayana and knew the second price was the dearer. "You all right?" he asked, and heard the smallness of it. "I am standing," she said, and he realized the sentence carried more weight than he had thought a line of 4 words could carry. By morning the ridge held more riders. This time Nalish was with them, and the elders wore ceremony in their hair. Cain came too, drawn by the smoke and the promise of a day that would require a statement. The judge rode up late, hat in hand, the law obliging him to follow the speed of horses. Ezekiel expected arguments. He received something else. Nalish stood in the yard and watched the burned edge of the porch, the scorched handrail, the bucket that had split from heat. He looked at Ayana's cheek, where the soot traced strength like scripture. Then he looked at Ezekiel and spoke so softly the wind had to lean close to hear. "Brother is a word that fences a field," he said. "It keeps some animals safe and keeps others from grazing. I made that fence when fear was near. Fear has walked on. The fence now blocks a different path." He lifted a hand, requesting, not commanding, Ayana and Eitel to stand near him. "I release Ezekiel Marsh from the tie that calls him my son. If he chooses a different tie, I will not stand in that door with a spear." The elders murmured the ritual answer. Cain started to protest, and then thought of the judge, and stayed his tongue with his teeth. The judge raised his hand like he was hailing a coach. "As long as both parties accept, the law is content," he said, and looked relieved to find himself on the easier side of history for once. Ayana did not look at Ezekiel first. She looked at the house, at the blackened step she had put her foot on 100 times, at the pump handle, at the corral. She looked at her sister. Eitel's nod was small but decisive, the kind of nod you give a person stepping onto a rope bridge. Ayana finally turned to Ezekiel. The heat in her eyes was not fire. It was the heat of iron before someone hammers it to a shape. "What do you choose?" she asked. He had spent months choosing mercy, as if it were a trail he could always see. He had chosen it in the creek, at the door, in court, in fire. This was not mercy. It was a request to step into a life loud enough to change other lives. He smiled and surprised himself by shaking his head. "Wrong question," he said gently. "What do we build?" Ayana's laugh was low and new. She stepped toward him, and when her hand found the side of his neck, it was careful enough to make him understand how strong she was. The ceremony that followed used 2 languages and 2 sets of witnesses, and pleased neither entirely. The elders said the words that changed the way a name sits on the tongue. The judge wrote his letters. Cain went through the motions of not scowling. Idol cried exactly once, and blamed smoke. Nalish watched as if sending a stone down a canyon where he would not see the end of its roll, but knew what kind of river would follow. They rebuilt in the way marriages rebuild, 1 board, 1 habit, 1 argument at a time. The trading grew. People traveled to barter under the shade of the cottonwoods where the pump now pulled a sweeter thread of water. The suitor who had thought river stones remembered him, found the river, remembered everything. The month-late hearing convened and concluded with a verdict that satisfied nobody entirely, and therefore counted as justice. Cain arrived sometimes with notices, sometimes with warnings that sounded like advice, sometimes with nothing but his horse to water. He learned, without admitting it, not to send men to raid the house where 2 giant sisters might be waiting. In spring, Ayana's belly rose like a hill a traveler learns to expect on the road home. Eitel teased without mercy, and served with it anyway, carrying sacks and lifting barrels, and pretending she wasn't lifting the house while she was at it. Nalish visited with the smile of an old man who has lived long enough to see a new story attached to his name. He walked with Ezekiel to the far fence, and for a moment there were 2 fathers working a property line. "I worried I made a chess problem when I tried to make peace," he said. "You did," Ezekiel answered. "We solved it by playing a different game." Nalish's eyes crinkled. "Keep changing games," he said. "Men who make rules hate that. It saves lives." On a day when he'd leaned close again like the first day, Ayana labored through pain with the controlled ferocity of a warrior who knew what prize she was fighting for. Idol's hands were steady as a midwife's, though she had never done it before. When the crying finally arrived, it sounded like a hawk and a river both. Ezekiel held the small, wet, furious life, and looked at the giant hands that would steady her when she fell, and the smaller ones that would teach her different grips for different ropes. He thought of the creek, of a 14-year-old saved and carried, of a porch burned and rebuilt, of a judge who found his better self, because the morning required it, and a marshal who sets his jaw against the wrong thing less hard than he used to. Cain came by 2 days later, which is to say, he came by human. He stood on the step, as if afraid to track dust onto the floor, and peered in at the bundle. The baby regarded him like a witness. He cleared his throat. "Territory's quiet this week," he said. "Figured I'd deliver official congratulations." He held out a paper with no writing on it. It was a joke so clumsy and so kind that Ezekiel took it anyway. Cain looked up, met Ayana's gaze, and did not look away. "If anyone gives you trouble," he said, and stopped. He had been the trouble. He was trying to say he would stand differently the next time. "If anyone gives you trouble," he said again, "send for me." Ayana nodded once. It was not forgiveness. It was acknowledgement that men sometimes learn. The child grew in a house where arguments were louder than gunshots and ended sooner. Where 2 languages braided into 1 rope. Where a pump handle shone from use and a porch rail kept a black edge as a reminder that wood forgets slower than men. Travelers told the story, how a rancher who could have saved himself by shutting his door opened it instead, how two giant Apache sisters chose dignity and found a future, how a chief played law like a drum until white and red feet kept the same beat, how a marshal disliked treaties and learned to obey them, how a judge discovered that justice is tighter work than writing his name. Years later, when the girl asked why there was a silvered scar along the doorframe, Ezekiel told the fire part and left out the fear. Ayana told the fear part and left in the laughter. Idol told both and added the weather. Knowledge told it as if it had happened to ancestors who were nearly myth. Cain, when asked in a saloon, told it with fewer lies each year. Mercy and justice keep their ledgers differently, but sometimes their columns add up to the same total. On the anniversary of the night the porch burned, Ezekiel stood at dusk with Ayana at his side, and Idol humming in the yard while the child stacked stones and patterns only she understood. The wind brought the smell of creosote and a memory of smoke with no thread in it. Across the fence, a rider paused to watch, then tipped his hat and moved on, because some scenes require witnesses and some require privacy. Ezekiel thought of the first day, the shade and the blood and the calculus of fear, and understood what it had cost him to open the door. Land dot geese. Sleep. The opinion of some men. The daily, honest ache of choosing it again. He understood also what it had bought, this hour, this hum, this rope of two languages, this weight against his shoulder and this shadow, beside his door big enough to make even lawmen feel like boys again. Mercy had not been free. It had been worth every installment. He kissed Ayana's temple and felt the old rawhide cord where it lay coiled in a drawer inside, the adoption untied and saved anyway because history is not a thing you throw out when it no longer fits. We built something, he said. She smiled at the dark coming in like a friend. We keep building, she said. Then she turned and called to Itel about tomorrow's fence posts, and Itel called back, and their daughter stacked one last stone and clapped as if to close the day with applause. And the desert took a breath and let it out slow, as if practicing being kind.